I stood at the edge of what used to be my beautiful lake, staring at the cracked mud and rotting fish scattered across the bottom like some apocalyptic wasteland. The industrial pumps had been running for 3 days straight, and my sanctuary was gone. 20 years I had saved for this dream property. 20 years of working double shifts and skipping vacations just to afford a slice of paradise with crystal clear water where I could fish at sunrise and kayak at sunset. Now it looked like the surface of Mars. The HOA president, Margaret Thornton, stood beside her black Mercedes, arms crossed, watching the destruction with a satisfied smile. She caught my eye and shrugged. "Environmental safety," she said, as if those two words could justify destroying an entire ecosystem. But what she did not know was that her fake environmental concerns were about to create a real environmental disaster. And when the storm clouds gathered 3 months later, those same pumps that emptied my lake would send millions of gallons of rainwater flowing directly into her $1 million mansion. 3 years ago, I thought I had found heaven on earth. After decades of apartment living in cramped suburban neighborhoods, I finally had enough saved for a down payment on my dream property. The real estate agent led me down a winding gravel road, past towering oak trees and wildflower meadows, until we reached a clearing that took my breath away. There it was, a pristine natural lake, maybe 2 acres in size, with water so clear I could see bass swimming near the bottom. Morning mist danced across the surface while a great blue heron stood motionless at the water's edge. Dragonflies skimmed the surface, and somewhere in the distance, a loon called out across the water. The house itself was modest. A simple 2-story cabin with weathered cedar siding and a wraparound porch that faced the lake. But it was perfect. I could already picture myself sitting on that porch with my morning coffee, watching the sunrise paint the water gold and orange. The seller, an elderly man named Frank, walked me around the property with obvious sadness in his eyes. "30 years I have lived here," he said, running his weathered hand along the dock railing. "My wife and I raised our kids on this lake, taught them to fish right from this spot." He was moving to Florida to be closer to his grandchildren, but I could tell he was leaving a piece of his heart behind. "Take care of her," he said, nodding toward the lake. "She has been good to us." The lakefront community was everything I had hoped for. 15 houses scattered around the water's edge, each with plenty of space and privacy. The neighbors were friendly but not intrusive. We would wave to each other from our docks and occasionally share a beer while watching the sunset. The homeowners association seemed reasonable enough. They maintained the common areas, organized an annual lake cleanup, and made sure everyone followed basic rules about septic systems and waterfront maintenance. The monthly dues were modest, and the board meetings were casual affairs held in someone's living room. My first 2 years there were pure bliss. I learned every inch of that lake. I knew where the bass liked to hide when the weather turned cold, which cove had the best fishing at dawn, and exactly where to position my kayak to catch the perfect sunset photo. I installed bird feeders around my property and watched in amazement as the wildlife population exploded. Cardinals and blue jays filled the air with song, while deer would come to drink at the water's edge just after sunrise. On weekends, I would spend entire days on the water, sometimes fishing, sometimes just floating in my kayak, listening to the gentle lapping of waves against the hull. The stress of my office job would melt away the moment I stepped onto my dock. This was my sanctuary, my refuge from the chaos of modern life. But paradise never lasts forever. The trouble started when the Morrison family moved into the largest house on the North Shore. Richard Morrison was a real estate developer from the city, and his wife Margaret had big ideas about property improvement, and community standards. Within 6 months of their arrival, Margaret had gotten herself elected as the new HOA president. The first sign something was wrong came in the form of a certified letter. I tore open the envelope while standing at my mailbox, expecting maybe a notice about the annual dues increase. Instead, I found a formal document with the HOA letterhead demanding that I address the environmental hazard posed by stagnant water on your property. I read the letter 3 times, certain there had been some mistake. Environmental hazard. My lake was home to more wildlife than a nature preserve. Stagnant water. The lake had a natural spring feed and a small outlet stream that kept the water fresh and flowing. But there it was, in black and white, demanding that I remediate the mosquito breeding ground and stagnant water hazard within 30 days or face legal action. My hands were shaking as I walked back to my house. This could not be happening, not to my lake, not to my sanctuary. The emergency HOA meeting was held in the community center the following Tuesday. I arrived early, hoping to speak with Margaret before things got started, but she was already surrounded by her allies, whispering in hushed tones and glancing in my direction. "Thank you all for coming," Margaret announced, calling the meeting to order. She was a thin woman in her 50s with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun and the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. "We are here to discuss a serious environmental and safety concern that affects our entire community." She clicked a remote, and a PowerPoint presentation appeared on the wall. The first slide read, "Stagnant water hazards in lakefront communities." I felt my stomach drop. "As many of you know," she continued, "stagnant water bodies can pose significant health risks to our families. Mosquito breeding, algae blooms, bacterial contamination, and potential drowning hazards all threaten our property values and quality of life." I raised my hand. "Excuse me, but are you talking about my lake? Because that water is not stagnant. It has a spring feed and natural outlet. The ecosystem is actually quite healthy." Margaret gave me that cold smile. "I appreciate your passion, but we have consulted with environmental experts who have expressed serious concerns about the current state of your water feature." Water feature. She called my lake a water feature. "What experts?" I asked. "I would like to see their report." "The HOA board has reviewed all necessary documentation," she replied curtly. "The decision has been made in the best interest of community safety." Over the next hour, Margaret presented slide after slide of cherry-picked information about the dangers of unmanaged water bodies. She showed photos of algae blooms from other lakes, statistics about mosquito-borne illnesses, and scary-sounding regulations about water management. What she did not mention was that none of those photos were from my lake. None of those statistics applied to a healthy, spring-fed ecosystem, and most of those regulations were for commercial developments, not private residential properties. But her presentation was slick and professional, designed to frighten people who did not know the difference between a polluted urban pond and a pristine natural lake. When she opened the floor for discussion, I stood up with a folder full of documentation. "I have water quality tests from the county health department," I said. "Independent biological surveys showing healthy fish and wildlife populations. Hydrological studies proving the water is constantly flowing, not stagnant." Margaret waved her hand dismissively. "We appreciate your research, but the HOA covenants give us the authority to address environmental hazards as we see fit. This is not a debate. It is a notification." "This is insane," I said, my voice rising. You want me to destroy a perfectly healthy ecosystem based on fake concerns about water quality. Please keep your voice down, Margaret said. Emotional outbursts will not change the facts. That was when Richard Morrison spoke up from the back of the room. Look, he said, we all want what is best for the community. Property values in lakefront neighborhoods depend on proper water management. A dried lake bed can be converted to useful green space that benefits everyone. Useful green space. Now I understood what this was really about. After the meeting, I cornered Jim Patterson, one of my longtime neighbors. Jim, you have lived here longer than anyone. You know my lake is not a health hazard. Jim looked uncomfortable, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. Look, I know your lake is fine, he said quietly. But the Morrisons have deep pockets and good lawyers. They are talking about assessments and legal fees if anyone opposes them. Most of us cannot afford to fight this. So you are just going to let them destroy the thing that makes this community special. Jim shrugged sadly. Sometimes you have to pick your battles, I am sorry. 2 weeks later, the certified letter arrived. The HOA was demanding immediate drainage of my lake, threatening daily fines of $500 until compliance was achieved. They had scheduled the work to begin the following Monday. I had 4 days to save my sanctuary, and I had no idea how to stop them. Monday morning arrived gray and overcast, matching my mood perfectly. I had spent the weekend making desperate phone calls to lawyers, environmental groups, and county officials, but everyone told me the same thing. HOA covenants are legal contracts, and fighting them requires time and money that I did not have. The industrial pumps arrived at 7 in the morning. 3 massive diesel units mounted on trailers, along with hundreds of feet of thick hose. The contractors set up their equipment with military precision, as if they had done this kind of environmental destruction many times before. I stood on my porch, coffee mug in hand, watching my world come to an end. The lead contractor, a weathered man in coveralls, walked up to me with a clipboard. "Sorry about this, buddy," he said quietly. "Orders are orders, but this seems like a real shame. Pretty lake you got here." "Is there any way we can delay this?" I asked. "Give me more time to work something out legally." He shook his head. "Lady with the fancy car over there says she will have us arrested if we do not start pumping by 8. Says you are in violation of some court order." Margaret stood beside her Mercedes, talking on her phone and gesturing toward my property. She had dressed for the occasion in designer jeans and pristine white sneakers, as if she were attending a garden party instead of overseeing ecological devastation. At exactly 8 o'clock, the pumps roared to life. The sound was deafening. 3 diesel engines running at full throttle, pushing water through massive hoses that snaked across my property like some kind of industrial parasite. The noise drowned out everything else. No birdsong, no lapping waves, no peaceful morning sounds that had been my daily soundtrack for 3 years. I watched in horror as the water level began to drop. Inch by inch, my lake was disappearing. The bass that had been feeding near the surface suddenly found themselves in shallower and shallower water. Schools of minnows swirled in confused circles as their world literally drained away beneath them. By noon, the first casualties appeared. Fish began washing up on the newly exposed mud flats, gasping for oxygen that no longer existed. I walked to the water's edge and tried to scoop some of the smaller fish into buckets, hopping to save them somehow, but there were too many and nowhere to put them. The great blue heron that had been a daily visitor to my property circled overhead, crying out in what sounded like distress. It landed once on the shrinking shoreline, looked around in obvious confusion, then flew away. I never saw it again. That evening, exhaustion and despair drove me inside, but sleep was impossible. The pumps ran 24 hours a day, their diesel engines coughing and rumbling like some mechanical death rattle. When I did manage to doze off, I would dream of drowning fish and dry lake beds. Day 2 was worse. The water level had dropped enough to expose the rocky bottom near the shoreline. Dead fish were everywhere now, their silver bodies scattered across the mud like coins thrown into a wishing well. The smell was beginning to build, a sickly sweet odor of decay that made my stomach turn. I called the county environmental office, desperate for any kind of intervention. The woman on the phone was sympathetic but unhelpful. HOA covenants are private contracts, she explained. Unless they are violating specific environmental laws, there is nothing we can do. What about the Clean Water Act? I asked. What about wetland protections? Private ponds do not usually qualify for federal protection, she said. You would need to prove that your lake connects to navigable waterways or provides critical habitat for protected species. I spent the rest of the day documenting everything with my camera. Photos of dead fish, videos of confused wildlife, time-lapse shots showing the steadily dropping water level. If I was going to lose this battle, at least I would have evidence of what had been destroyed. By day 3, my lake was gone. What had once been 2 acres of crystal-clear water was now a muddy crater filled with rotting vegetation and dead fish. The spring feed still bubbled up from the center, but now it just created a small, muddy puddle that would dry up within hours. Margaret and her husband walked the perimeter of the empty lake bed that evening, taking measurements and making notes. They were already planning its future, discussing property lines and development possibilities, as if my destroyed ecosystem was nothing more than a construction site. I stood at my living room window, looking out at the devastation, and felt something break inside me. This was not just about property rights or HOA politics anymore. This was about justice. This was about making sure that people who destroy beautiful things pay a price for their cruelty. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. If they wanted to play legal games, I would learn to play them better. The county courthouse opened at 8 in the morning, and I was waiting at the door when the clerk arrived. My defeat had transformed overnight into something sharper and more focused. Anger, yes, but channeled into methodical determination. If Margaret and her allies wanted a legal fight, I would give them one they would never forget. The records office was a maze of filing cabinets and computer terminals, presided over by a patient woman named Betty who had worked there for 30 years. When I explained what I needed, her eyebrows rose. HOA property disputes, she said, shaking her head. We see more of those every year. Rich folks moving to the country and trying to turn it into suburbia. She led me to a corner desk equipped with a computer terminal and a microfilm reader. Everything you need should be in here. Property deeds, HOA covenants, zoning records, environmental permits. What exactly are you looking for? Evidence, I said simply. I started with the original property deeds, going back to when the lakefront community was first developed in 1987. The language was clear and specific. Each property owner had riparian rights to any natural water features on their land, including lakes, streams, ponds, and wetlands. The HOA covenants from that era mentioned water management only in the context of septic system regulations and dock maintenance. But somewhere along the way, things had changed. In 2019, new HOA bylaws had been filed that gave the board expanded authority over environmental hazards and community safety concerns. The language was vague and broad, clearly designed to give the board maximum flexibility in decision-making. I photographed every document, creating a timeline of how my property rights had been slowly eroded over the years. But the real smoking gun came when I started researching the board members themselves. Richard Morrison's business disclosure forms revealed partnerships with 3 different development companies, all of which specialized in lakefront property enhancement and residential construction. One of those companies, Clearwater Development LLC, had filed preliminary surveys of my property just 2 months before the lake drainage began. Margaret Morrison served on the board of directors for 2 environmental consulting firms that had somehow produced the expert analysis supporting the drainage decision. Both firms were paid consultants for Clearwater Development. The conflicts of interest were staggering, but I was just getting started. I spent the next week buried in legal databases, environmental regulations, and public records. What I found was a pattern of corruption and procedural violations that went far beyond simple conflicts of interest. The HOA had never obtained permits from the state environmental agency before draining my lake. Under the Clean Water Act, any activity that disturbs more than half an acre of wetlands requires federal permits and environmental impact studies. My lake qualified as a jurisdictional wetland because of its spring feed and seasonal overflow into a downstream creek. The board had violated their own procedural rules by holding the drainage vote in a closed session without proper notification of all homeowners. According to the original HOA covenants, any major environmental decision required a community-wide vote with at least 30 days' notice. Most damaging of all, I discovered that Clearwater Development had already submitted preliminary plans to the county for a luxury housing subdivision on the exact location of my former lake. The plans were dated 3 weeks before the HOA vote, proving that the decision to drain my lake had been made long before any environmental concerns were raised. I printed out hundreds of pages of documentation, creating thick binders organized by topic and date. Environmental violations, procedural violations, conflicts of interest, fraud, conspiracy. The evidence was overwhelming, but I needed someone with legal expertise to help me turn it into a weapon. That someone turned out to be Jennifer Walsh, an environmental lawyer who specialized in cases involving wetlands destruction and HOA abuse. Her office was in the state capitol, an hour's drive from my house, but she agreed to meet with me after I explained what I had found. Jennifer was younger than I had expected, maybe 40, with short red hair and the kind of intense focus that told me she did not take cases unless she planned to win them. I spread my binders across her conference table and walked her through the evidence. She listened without interruption, taking notes and occasionally asking for clarification. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and smiled for the first time since I had walked into her office. "This is not just a case," she said. "This is a federal environmental crime scene. The permit violations alone could result in criminal charges and millions in fines. The fraud and corruption charges could put some of these people in prison. So you will take the case." "I will take the case," she said. "But I want you to understand something. We are not just going to get your lake back. We are going to make an example out of these people that will be remembered for decades." For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to smile. Margaret and her allies had no idea what was coming their way. Jennifer moved fast. Within 48 hours of our meeting, she had filed a federal lawsuit in district court alleging violations of the Clean Water Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, and the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. RICO charges meant that we were not just claiming environmental violations, we were alleging criminal conspiracy. The media attention was immediate and devastating for the HOA board. The local newspaper ran a front-page story with the headline, "Federal Charges Filed in Lake Drainage Scandal." The article included aerial photos of my destroyed lake alongside pictures of Margaret and Richard Morrison at various charity galas and political fundraisers. Within hours, the story had been picked up by regional television stations and environmental blogs. Suddenly, my small lakefront community was famous for all the wrong reasons. The first crack in the HOA's facade came from an unexpected source. Karen Bradley, who lived on the South Shore and had been one of Margaret's most vocal supporters, called me on a Thursday evening. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice shaking. "Can you meet me at the old boat launch in 20 minutes?" Karen was waiting by her car when I arrived, looking around nervously as if she expected to be followed. "I should have spoken up sooner," she said without preamble. "Margaret and Richard offered to buy my property for 3 times its assessed value if I supported the lake drainage. They tried to bribe you." "Not just me. At least 4 other homeowners got similar offers. They told us that removing the lake would open up opportunities for luxury development that would make us all rich." Karen pulled out her phone and showed me a text message chain with Margaret. I saved all the communications. Dates, amounts, promises of construction contracts for our husbands' businesses. This was exactly what Jennifer needed to prove conspiracy. Karen agreed to sign an affidavit and turn over all her communications with the Morrison family. But the real breakthrough came when the Federal Environmental Protection Agency launched their own investigation. Armed with Jennifer's evidence of permit violations, EPA investigators swarmed the property with water quality testing equipment, soil samples, and aerial photography drones. The lead investigator, a serious woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, spent an entire day documenting the environmental damage. She took core samples from the dried lake bed, collected specimens of dead fish and vegetation, and interviewed me extensively about the lake's natural history. "This was a pristine spring-fed ecosystem," she told me as she packed up her equipment. "The biodiversity loss alone represents thousands of dollars in environmental damage. The illegal wetlands destruction could result in fines of up to $37,000 per day since the violation began." The math was staggering. At $37,000 per day for 3 months, the potential fines exceeded $3 million. Margaret and Richard hired a team of expensive lawyers from the state capitol, but their legal strategy fell apart almost immediately. The evidence of corruption was too extensive and too well documented to deny or explain away. Court filings revealed the full scope of their scheme. Clearwater Development had planned to purchase the lake property for a fraction of its true value once the ecosystem was destroyed. They would then build luxury homes on the reclaimed land, splitting the profits with the Morrison family and their allies on the HOA board. The plan would have worked perfectly if they had managed to keep their procedural violations and conflicts of interest hidden. But my research had exposed every detail of their conspiracy. The federal judge assigned to the case, the Honorable Patricia Williams, was known for her tough stance on environmental crimes. During the preliminary hearing, she listened to arguments from both sides with obvious skepticism toward the HOA's position. "Let me understand this correctly," Judge Williams said to Margaret's lawyer. "Your clients drained a natural lake without environmental permits, violated their own procedural rules, failed to disclose conflicts of interest, and entered into secret agreements with development companies, all while claiming their actions were motivated by environmental concerns. Your Honor, the HOA board acted in good faith based on legitimate safety concerns. Counselor, the judge interrupted, I have reviewed the evidence submitted by the plaintiffs. Good faith is not the phrase I would use to describe your client's behavior. 3 days later, Judge Williams issued a temporary restraining order that halted all development activity on the property and froze the assets of everyone involved in the conspiracy. More importantly, she ordered the immediate restoration of the lake ecosystem at the defendant's expense. Margaret's reign of terror was over, but the real justice was just beginning. The courtroom was packed when Judge Williams delivered her final ruling 6 months later. Environmental activists, legal observers, and curious neighbors filled every seat, while news cameras captured the historic moment. Judge Williams did not mince words. Her 43-page written opinion read like a legal thriller, detailing every aspect of the conspiracy with ruthless precision. The defendants engaged in a systematic pattern of fraud, corruption, and environmental destruction, she began. Their actions represent not merely a violation of federal environmental law, but a betrayal of the fundamental trust that must exist between community leaders and the residents they are sworn to serve. The financial penalties were devastating. The Morrison family and their co-conspirators were jointly liable for $4.2 million in environmental fines, plus an additional $1.8 million in restoration costs. Individual board members faced personal bankruptcy as their assets were seized to satisfy the judgment. But the restoration order was the real masterpiece of justice. Judge Williams had consulted with a team of environmental engineers and hydrologists to design a restoration plan that would not just replace my destroyed lake, but actually improve upon the original ecosystem. The new lake would be 20% larger, with enhanced fish habitat, improved water circulation, and protected wetland areas that would attract even more wildlife. Construction began immediately under the supervision of the EPA and a team of environmental contractors. I watched in amazement as crews worked to repair the damage that had taken only 3 days to create. First, they installed a sophisticated spring-fed circulation system that would keep the water fresh and oxygenated year-round. Native aquatic plants were reintroduced to provide food and shelter for fish populations. Gravel beds were installed to create spawning areas for bass and bluegill. The shoreline was redesigned with natural stone and native vegetation that would prevent erosion while providing habitat for birds and small mammals. A network of shallow wetlands was added around the perimeter, creating perfect breeding areas for waterfowl and amphibians. Margaret Morrison was forced to sell her mansion to help pay the restoration costs. I watched from my porch as the moving trucks carried away her designer furniture and expensive artwork. She avoided eye contact as she loaded her personal belongings into a rental car, her once perfect hair disheveled and her face drawn with stress. Richard Morrison's development company filed for bankruptcy, and criminal charges were pending for environmental fraud and conspiracy. Their dreams of luxury lakefront development had turned into a nightmare of legal bills and prison sentences. The community transformation was remarkable. Neighbors who had been afraid to speak out during Margaret's reign of terror now stopped by regularly to check on the restoration progress and share their relief that the nightmare was over. Jim Patterson, who had been too intimidated to support me during the initial fight, became one of my strongest allies. I should have stood up to them from the beginning, he said as we watched workers install the new dock system. I was a coward, and I am sorry." "You were protecting your family," I replied. "I understand that." But the real vindication came when the restoration was complete and the lake began to fill again. Spring water bubbled up through the enhanced circulation system, creating a gentle current that kept the water crystal clear. The new wetlands filled with cattails and water lilies, while the improved fish habitat attracted schools of minnows and larger predator fish. Within weeks, wildlife began returning. The great blue heron reappeared, standing motionless in the shallow water near the new fishing pier. Ducks and geese discovered the enhanced wetlands and began building nests. Eagles soared overhead, drawn by the abundant fish population. But the most satisfying moment came when the property values were reassessed. The restored lake, with its improved ecosystem and legal protections, had increased every property value in the community by an average of 30%. Even Margaret and Richard's former allies, who had initially supported the drainage, saw their home values soar. The irony was perfect. Margaret's plan to increase property values through development had backfired spectacularly. The restored natural lake had created more wealth for homeowners than any luxury subdivision could have achieved. More importantly, the legal precedent set by our case was already being cited in similar HOA disputes across the country. Environmental lawyers were using Judge Williams' opinion as a blueprint for fighting corruption and protecting natural resources from development schemes. My lake was not just restored. It was better than ever, legally protected, and serving as a symbol of what happens when ordinary people refuse to be bullied by corrupt authority figures. But the ultimate revenge was still to come. 6 months after the restoration was complete, I received an unexpected phone call from Jennifer Walsh. The federal EPA had been so impressed with our victory that they wanted to offer me a position as a community liaison for environmental protection cases. "You have become something of a legend in environmental law circles," Jennifer explained. "The agency wants to create a new program to help ordinary citizens